repetition. Okay, so we looked at breaking off into different pathways in our code and returning back to the main line. But sometimes we want to repeat blocks of code, okay? And it'd be silly to keep rewriting processes, especially if they repeat over 100 times. So instead we have a control structure that will repeat these things for us. Let's have a look at the first one, a pre-test loop. So let's look at the flowchart straight away. We've got a condition here. If it's false, we jump down straight to the bottom. But if it's true, we do a process and then we return back up again back to the condition. So we can see where that loop starts here. While this condition is true, keep repeating this process. And as soon as that condition gets set to false for whatever reason, then finish the loop. That's why it's called a pre-test loop. Pre implies before, like previously. The word, that prefix pre. So the condition is before the process or processes. And the pseudocode, so the keyword for the pre-test loop is a while, an end while, and basically while and then a condition here. Okay, so the condition might be comparing two variables. While that condition is true, do this process. We get to the end and we come back to the top. Is that condition still true? Yes. Do the process or processes, and that continues going, and then we might get to the top and then that condition is set to false for whatever reason, and then we would jump straight to end while and continue on with the rest of our code. That's a pre-test loop. The next type of repetition is a post-test loop. So let's jump straight into the flowchart. We come down to our main line and we get to a process first. So that process would run, we then get to the condition, and if that condition is false, we'd come back above the process and repeat it again. But if it's true, we would continue off into the main line of the program. The only difference between the pre-test and the post-test loop is that the condition is after the initial process or processes. That's why the word post is used. For example, post-try celebration is when the players will celebrate after the try. Hopefully they're not going to do pre-try celebrations. And that condition is, or question is asked after the process. Whereas before, I'll just jump back, the question or condition was asked before. Now, why will we do one or the other? Well, it depends on the situation, and we'll get into that, and we'll see different situations later on. But the main thing to notice is, in a post-test loop, the process will run at least once. Whereas in a pre-test loop, sometime if we get to this condition, it's false straight away, then we would never ever run that process. And look at the pseudocode as well. So we have the repeat until keywords there. So that's the start and end of our control structure for a post-test loop. And the repeat just represents this part here where we know where we start our loop. The processes or process will go in here, and the until is where the condition is tested, and until that condition is set to true, keep repeating, keep repeating, keep repeating. And then once it is true, then we'd finish our loop and continue on the main line. Finally, we have a counted loop. Now, this type of control structure is a repetition or repeat something, but this is a bit different in that we would use this control structure if we know our start and end point, or our how many times the loop is going to run. Okay, so the keywords for this, and I'll start with the keywords in pseudocode first because the flowchart doesn't really apply very well to this control structure. We use the for and the next to indicate the start and end of our loop, and let's focus on this where our condition would usually go here. This is for variable equals start to finish step increment. Okay, that's a lot of words to learn in one hit. But all we need to focus on here is the start and the finish. Okay, the start would be our first point for our variable. So for example, we might be trying to count in our program. We might have a variable that starts at 1. And we want to count up to 10 and finish at 10. So we'd say for variable equals 1, to 10, and what would happen is this would repeat 10 times. And then each time through, the variable would be a new value. So the first time through, it would be 1, variable would be 1. Next time would be 2, until we get to 10, and then the loop would stop after it does the statements for 10. This step increment is an optional part, which indicates how much we're counting up by. Sometimes we leave that out if we're counting up by 1. If we're not counting up by 1, we'd add in how much we're counting up by. So for example, we could do step 2, which would mean start at 1, but then the next loop add 2, and that would jump to 3, 5, 7, 9, and then once it gets to 11, it would finish. We can also increment in the negative direction by saying step -1, and that would decrement or start at a number and go back to an endpoint. Okay, so the reason why I'm not really talking about the flowchart too much is it's not very easy to show a start and an endpoint with a control structure, and we don't have any conditions here, so it's hard. But we're also repeating, so it's hard to show that with a flowchart. The best way to do it is if we have our start point. So for example here, I is equal to 0 is our start point, and our end point is 12. So we put the start point in a process, and then a condition saying is our variable at the finish yet, and if it is, complete the loop. If it's not, keep repeating that loop. Okay. So when we're talking about counted loops, it's probably best that we only really use pseudocode. Okay, a quick summary. We've learned a lot so far, and it's impossible to remember all these control structures just from this video. So we're going to have to really apply ourselves and try to look for different situations where we can actually use these processes and these control structures. But a quick summary is that control structure controls the flow or the pathways of an algorithm. We have 3 main types: a sequence, a selection, and repetition. Sequence is one after the other. Selection is breaking off into different pathways. Repetitions is repeating blocks of code or blocks of processes. And a selection has 2 types of selections. We can have either a binary selection where it does a pathway of 2 selections or 2 pathways, but a multi-way selection can have many or almost as many as you want pathways and do different processes based on each pathway. The repetitions that we have a pre-test loop where the condition is asked before the processes, a post-test loop where the condition is asked after the processes, and finally a counted loop is where we know how many repetitions we're going to be doing, and we set a start and end point for those repetitions. And that's it.